So happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is JB Matthew. I'm the lead coordinator of this UTM public lecture on nonviolence, organized by the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I would first like to invite Bill Goff, Vice Principal Academic and Dean, to deliver the land acknowledgement and the welcome address.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Professor Matthews. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon, or late afternoon, early evening, to introduce the closing lecture and reception to what has been, these remarks were made earlier, so I've confirmed this, a vital day of academic discussion and debate organized by the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. So really pleased to hear how well things have been going. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Last week, Louis Bush, the Special Project Officer in charge of Indigenous curriculum and pedagogies on this campus, led a workshop entitled, "Thanks for the Land, Now Let's Begin." He reminded us that land acknowledgements, like the one I just offered, should not be treated as a perfunctory gesture to check off before moving on. Rather, they should serve as a moment of genuine reflection, a summoning of Indigenous traditions of gratitude to the land that is meant to color and deepen the activities that follow. It feels especially fitting then, as a lecture dedicated to the power and efficacy of nonviolent mass protest, to recognize that the very practice of offering land acknowledgements is in itself the result of generations of Indigenous resistance. Across centuries, and particularly throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Indigenous peoples have mobilized nonviolently against colonial dispossession through mass litigation, economic disruption, intertribal alliances, blockades, and even flash mobs of traditional dance and drum circles during the Idle No More movement. Their struggle for acknowledgement for what they are owed and what we all owe the land is a powerful testament to what can be achieved even when one is outmanned, outgunned, and even outlawed. So our speaker today, Professor Mantena, argues, I was pausing on it because I had her say her name, which apparently can be said a number of different ways, argues that the strength of nonviolent protest lies in the ability to disrupt entrenched attitudes and political alignments. In the case of Mahatma Gandhi, his teachings helped to catalyze a movement that ultimately contributed to the dismantling of the British Empire, the largest and most consequential empire in history. As our invited speakers have examined throughout today's workshop, it's important to recognize that nonviolent protest is not without its political limits. It is neither the universal remedy nor the most appropriate strategy in every instance of human conflict. Yet, at its best, it can create the conditions for a tipping point in public opinion, and through that shift profound political transformation. Thank you to Karuna Mantena for sharing her lecture on Gandhi with us today, and to Professor J.B. Matthew and the Chair of Political Science, Stephen Bernstein, for spearheading the events of this day. Thank you very much for your great work. I would also like to extend my gratitude to our international panel of experts for contributing to a dialogue that is as timely as it is important. We are honored to welcome you to the University of Toronto, Mississauga. I'd like to finish with a quote from Canoe, part of the Ojibways of the Onegami First Nation and the Premier of the province of Ontario. We have a choice in life. We can choose how we are going to behave. We can determine whether we reflect the good around us or lose ourselves in darkness. Thank you all and welcome to Professor Matheny.
Thanks, Bill. Now, Stephen Bernstein, Chair of the Department of Political Science, will say a few words.
Thank you, JB. It's always a tough act to follow. And a double thank you to everyone here. I'm really honored and feel privileged to welcome you on behalf of the Department of Political Science. Welcome to colleagues at University of Toronto and to members of the community. I'm really glad that you all could come to this talk. As I said to our group of visitors this morning, and prior to the workshop portion that we had earlier today, I think I'm stating the obvious that the notion of nonviolence could not be more important in the current context, when many of the world's leaders feel, frankly, unconstrained in their impulse to use violence or threats of violence to achieve their aims. They also seem to believe, and I think this is against the lessons of history, that unrestrained violence will increase their power and that they need not worry, or they need to worry little about justice in such a world. The challenge to this way of thinking by theories and practices of nonviolence in political life could not be more important. And in this context, we're extremely fortunate to have Professor Mantena, one of the world's deepest thinkers on the politics of nonviolence, and especially its relationship to protest and democracy here in this current political environment. As a political scientist who doesn't study nonviolence specifically, I am especially impressed by Professor Mantena and our other guests who I had the privilege of hearing today, in how their work engages with the rich and deeply ethical tradition of nonviolence, while also grappling with sobering and realistic assessments of the international tensions that we're facing and the political limits of nonviolent politics. And again, just to put a finer point on it, engagement with these tensions seems especially needed given the complex political struggles in many societies and certainly globally. Before turning it back to JB to introduce our speaker and give her biography, I wanted to, there he is. JB, I wanted to especially thank JB. A lot of work goes into planning these events. And I also want to thank the staff in political science who did a lot of work in the background to make this successful. This was, I don't know, more than 6 months in the making, I think. And so I really appreciate JB's efforts in doing this. And I wanted to thank Bill Goff, who you just heard from, and the Dean's Office and Ajay Rao, who have been major forces in what is really a larger initiative around nonviolence at UTM, and also Alex Gillespie, who's not going to say anything, but who I do want to introduce, who's our principal here at UTM, and the support of the principal's office has been really essential in helping us with this event. So thanks to you all again for coming, and I look forward to a really terrific discussion. Over to you, JB.
It's my privilege to introduce Professor Karuna Mantena to you all. We couldn't have asked for a better person to give this lecture on nonviolence. Professor Mantena is currently a professor of political science at Columbia University. In the past, she was an associate professor at Yale, and prior to that, taught at Cornell. Since 2011, she has also been the co-director of the Conference for the Study of Political Thought, an esteemed international organization of scholars committed to the study of historical and contemporary political thought. She has been honored with multiple awards, including the Balzan Skinner Fellowship, Elizabeth Adisesaya Award, and most recently, and people in India probably know, the Infosys Prize in Social Sciences. I would like to characterize Professor Mantena as a thinker who interrupts the standard way of thinking and provides us with an unexpected plot twist to an existing story. In the empire literature, within the history of political thought, there were two standard stories. One was the traditional liberal view of imperialism as developmentalist and ultimately an emancipatory project for the imperial subjects. And the other, which exposed the supposed emancipatory project of liberal imperialism as a cover for domination rather than emancipation. Professor Mantena's much acclaimed book, Alibis of the Empire, adds a twist to that story. Through an exhaustive reading of the ideas of Henry Maine, the law member of the Viceroy's Council in India, and later professor of comparative jurisprudence at Oxford and Cambridge, her book claimed that in the second half of 19th century, the alibi for imperial rule changed from improving the moral and material conditions of the imperial subjects and developing them to that of protecting their traditional society, its customary institutions, and property relations. This became the basis for a shift in British imperial policies from forms of what is called as direct rule to indirect rule, not only in India, but also elsewhere in the empire. So in Africa, the British ruled mediated by the tribal chieftainship, who were supposed to administer their traditional societies through customary laws. But the reason we have invited Professor Mantena is because of her expertise in the political thought of Gandhi and more broadly in nonviolence. On these topics too, she interrupts the standard thinking, adds a twist, and paves the way for new ways of thinking. Her highly praised article, Another Realism, gave a unique interpretation of Gandhi. Before this article, we had the interpretations of Gandhi as either a saintly moral idealist or in some cynical accounts as wily politician. Professor Mantena, through a rigorous reading of Gandhi's thought, presents us with a Gandhi who is a politician, but neither wily nor a moral idealist, but a politician who is deeply aware of the violent realities of the political world and its tendency to domination, and who crafts his own nonviolent politics of satyagraha as a realist counter to that reality. But the point is not just that Gandhi is a pragmatic politician, but that Gandhi has a realist theory of politics itself, responding not only to the violent realities of politics, but also to the unintended consequences of intentionally good moralism and idealism. The new twist continues in her article on competing theories of nonviolent politics, where she complicates the standard distinction between principled forms of nonviolence versus strategic forms of nonviolence, not by blurring the line between the two or collapsing one within the other, like others did, but rather she identifies two competing versions, even within the strategic forms of violence, one nonviolence as collective power, the other as disciplined action. And the one geared towards mass mobilization, the other towards psychological transformation and persuasion. I can go on, but I will stop here because I know you are here to listen to here directly. So a warm welcome, Professor Mantena.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks you, especially JB, for organizing this event, for inviting me to it, and for a wonderful introduction, which I would happily let you finish and enter into my talk. And I would like to also thank the University of Toronto, Mississauga Department of Political Science for all their generous organization and shepherding, and of course to the participants, speakers and listeners and question givers of the earlier session, which actually I think all of what we discussed earlier will continue directly into this talk. So the title of my talk is Why Gandhi Rejected Violence in Mass Protest. Satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance, was never just a politics aimed at avoiding violence at all costs. There was a positive goal and dynamic at stake. Gandhi's goal was to find a political method through which the oppressed could realize their power and transform entrenched views more effectively than either traditional liberal politics or armed rebellion. Gandhi's first experiments in this new political method, what he called satyagraha, began in South Africa in the first decade of the 20th century and came to fruition in the mass campaigns in India against British rule in the 1920s and 30s, a high point of which was the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. Since then, nonviolence has spread westward, establishing itself as a potent force in the US civil rights movement. Indeed, that adoption, I think, was key to its global survival. Other key moments in the global spread of nonviolent politics include the anti-authoritarian struggles of the 1980s and 90s, such as the People Power movement in the Philippines, the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. More recently, in this century and closer to home, the Occupy movement and the movement for Black Lives were predominantly nonviolent. At the same time, many contemporary movements are skeptical in their attitude to the philosophy of nonviolence. They treat nonviolence as a pragmatic choice rather than a moral and political necessity. In fact, for the most part, contemporary protest movements reject some of the core tactics and ideas championed by Gandhi and I think King, and I would associate with what I would call classical nonviolence, notions of discipline, sacrifice, suffering, and persuasion. Those ideas are viewed often as unnecessary or as outmoded religious and moral commitments and practices. I think this dismissal is in part based on a misconception of these ideas and practices and the positive role they played in protest. I think this is an irony that nonviolent movements tend to reject the philosophy of nonviolence, and it shows that despite the success of nonviolence for surviving and its impact in the 20th century and the undeniable fact that nonviolent mass protests will continue to be, I think, a foundational feature of 21st century politics across the globe. I think the irony is really what exactly nonviolent action is and how it works is neither clear nor uncontroversial. This is one of the reasons I think it is important to understand better how its earliest champions, like Gandhi, understood the purpose of nonviolent protest and how it ought to work. When we picture nonviolent protests today, we tend to imagine large crowds, sometimes vast in size, occupying public spaces, especially squares, parks, and streets. These are probably well known. The left is Tahrir Square, the right is Zuccotti Park near Wall Street. So what we picture is people marching, waving signs, chanting slogans, confronting some institutional and state authority. Disruption on a mass scale, without doubt, has become the most iconic and celebrated feature of nonviolent resistance. In Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's now classic book, Why Civil Resistance Works, they showed that across the 20th century, movements using mass non-cooperation and large-scale civil disobedience could successfully bring down even the most authoritarian regimes. The reason was that nonviolent movements elicited participation from large numbers of people more effectively and efficiently than armed movements ever could. This was what they called a participation advantage, made nonviolence twice as effective as armed rebellion in overturning governments. For Gandhi, however, nonviolent protests required something more than the peaceful mobilization of large numbers of people. More than size, what matters was the how. What mattered was how you protest. That is, what is enacted and dramatized through protest. For Gandhi, this involved staging and performing acts of self-discipline, suffering, restraint, sacrifice, in order to demonstrate a different kind of power. This was key. And I think it was also, this was the aspect which makes nonviolence a distinctive genre of protest, beyond simply gathering people, and also key to understanding its efficacy. So the power of nonviolent protest, what I'd like to show, works not through overpowering or outnumbering opponents, but by creatively disrupting attitudes and alignments to make political transformation possible. This is a positive dynamic. This I take to be the positive dynamic and purpose of nonviolence. It's persuasive power or potentially persuasive power. And the second half of the talk will focus on those dynamics. But I'll begin by clarifying the negative side, which we often associate, why Gandhi thought violence was futile or counterproductive in protest politics. The two arguments are obviously connected. For Gandhi, violence, coercion, intimidation undermines the persuasive and transformative possibilities of dramatization by hardening identities, escalating conflict, and reproducing the logic of domination. So firstly, then, all the way, okay. Yeah. Firstly, then, I start with an account of Gandhi's rejection of violence in 3 stages as the theory and practice of satyagraha matured and developed from South Africa to the mass campaigns in India. And then I'll turn to the question of dramatization and its role in nonviolent protest. Use a computer too. Okay. Slow. Okay. Okay, so first, Gandhi's critique of violence. It may seem odd to insist that avoiding violence was not Gandhi's primary goal. After all, Gandhi is the 20th century's most famous champion of nonviolence. But I want us to remember, firstly, that Gandhi was never really an orthodox pacifist. He famously supported British war efforts in South Africa, serving as an ambulance runner, and the First World War, to which he tried to recruit Indian volunteers. He would debate and defend these stances with his pacifist friends throughout his life. More pertinent to my argument, Gandhi did not use the term ahimsa, which is the translation of nonviolence, or even introduce the English term nonviolence into his theoretical vocabulary until 1917, almost a decade after the invention of satyagraha, his first campaigns in South Africa, and the writing of Hind Swaraj, his most famous political work. But what guided Gandhi's politics from the start was not the pursuit of nonviolence as such, but satyagraha, which he loosely translated as grasping onto truth, as a novel mode of mass politics. Gandhi was born in Gujarat in 1869 and spent his formative years as a student in London, but it was his first sustained professional experience as a lawyer in South Africa in the 1890s that set him on his political path. All right. Arriving in 1893, Gandhi remained in South Africa for 21 years. In South Africa, he began his political life as an organizer for Indian interests, contesting racial restrictions that included disenfranchisement, immigration controls, and discriminatory legislation as the country moved towards apartheid in the turn of the century. Initially, Gandhi worked squarely within the framework of liberal politics. He helped found the Natal Indian Congress in 1894, engaged in pamphleteering, petitioning, and lobbying officials in South Africa, India, and Britain. He also used his legal skills to design small-scale acts of disobedience to test various laws in the courts. Over time, though, Gandhi came to recognize the limits of these liberal methods. Facts, legal arguments, and appeals to fairness were simply ignored. Reflecting back in 1931, he wrote, "Reason failed to produce an impression when the critical moment arrived in South Africa. Something more disruptive was needed, something that would force the government to acknowledge Indian grievances." This was his realization in 1906, the decisive turning point in Gandhi's political thought and career. In response to a new Transvaal law requiring compulsory re-registration of Asians, Gandhi called for organized non-compliance. Quote, "No self-respecting Indian," he argued, "could submit to such humiliation." At a mass meeting, this was the center picture here, at the top, at a mass meeting at the Empire Theatre in Johannesburg, 3,000 participants took a solemn pledge to resist the law and willingly court arrest rather than comply. What followed were coordinated acts of civil disobedience, crossing borders illegally, selling goods without licenses, burning registration certificates, all designed to fill the jails. This was the birth of satyagraha as a coordinated collective political practice. Only later did Gandhi develop a systematic argument. Only later did Gandhi develop a systematic argument for why Satyagraha was superior to violence. That argument appeared famously in Hind Swaraj, Indian Home Rule, written in 1909 during a return voyage from London to South Africa. The immediate provocation was the assassination of Sir William Curzon Wyllie by Madan Lal Dhingra, an Indian student associated with militant national groups in London. Gandhi was alarmed by the enthusiasm that this act generated among fellow Indians. He believed it revealed how deeply many of his compatriots had come to accept the idea that Indian resistance required adopting, quote, modern methods of violence. Hind Swaraj was written in part to counter this growing attraction to terrorism, which Gandhi bluntly characterized as a suicidal policy. The appeal of violence, Gandhi argued, rested on a mistaken desire to emulate modern civilization. Nationalists imagined freedom as, quote, English rule without the Englishman, accepting the premise that political power ultimately rests on force. For Gandhi, this was not true power or strength, but weakness. To pursue Swaraj through violence would merely reproduce an imperial, unequal state, replacing British rulers with Indian ones, while leaving the majority, the masses, still enslaved. Violence was also suicidal in a second sense. It invited repression, hardened despotism, and created cycles of retaliation that would ultimately be unmanageable. In Hind Swaraj, Gandhi offered a psychological account of why violence was so self-defeating. This emerges most clearly in his parable of the thief in the chapter on brute force. When a well-armed man robs you, Gandhi observes, you react with anger and the desire for revenge. You channel and justify retaliation as justice, persuading yourself and others that you are acting for the public good, and you mobilize others to strike back. The thief responds in kind, escalating the conflict and dragging innocent neighbors into danger. Soon you are trapped. To retreat would be a disgrace, yet persistence only deepens fear, instability, and resentment. What began as righteous anger devolves into perpetual insecurity. Violence, Gandhi suggests, feeds on psychological investments, ego, pride, fear, that make escalation difficult to stop. These insights into the psychological temptation of violence would take on a new urgency when Gandhi returned to India and launched countrywide mass movements against British rule. The Rowlatt Satyagraha of 1919 and the non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 22 catapulted Gandhi to national leadership and transformed the Indian National Congress into a mass organization primed for mobilization. But these movements also revealed a new problem, a kind of violence emerging from within the movement itself. Both campaigns were marked by unexpected and repeated outbreaks of violence, which Gandhi later described as his Himalayan blunders or miscalculations. The Rowlatt Satyagraha began with a nationwide hartal, a coordinated suspension of work. This was in April 1919. It was accompanied by fasting, processions, and public meetings. Civil disobedience followed in the form of distributing prohibited literature. But in parts of Bombay and Gujarat, protests turned violent, government buildings were attacked, jails burned, telegraph wires cut, trains sabotaged, and several Europeans killed. Gandhi abruptly called off the campaign, concluding that a drastic self-correction was necessary. The government responded to the Rowlatt campaign with severe repression, including the infamous massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, or the Amritsar massacre. But in addition to pausing the campaign, Gandhi looked for alternatives to civil disobedience, eventually innovating a new form of mass satyagraha as non-cooperation. This new strategy merged the opposition to the Rowlatt Acts with demands for justice for Punjab because of the massacre and support for the ongoing Khilafat movement under a reorganized Congress with the goal of achieving Swaraj in 1 year, as this famous slogan went. When Gandhi first introduced non-cooperation, he distinguished it sharply from civil disobedience. The early stages of non-cooperation involved voluntary withdrawal from government institutions, renouncing titles, boycotting schools, boycotting councils, courts, and foreign cloth. These acts were legal, non-confrontational, and what he would call innocent, safe for everyone, including children. As the movement gathered strength and repression intensified, this distinction would collapse. By late 1921, Gandhi endorsed a new trial of mass civil disobedience in the form of non-payment of taxes as a challenge to the regime's authority as a whole. It was called total disobedience. The campaign was to begin in Bardoli, Gujarat, but before it could, violence at Chauri Chaura, a small town in then the United Provinces, abruptly brought everything to a halt. After police fired on demonstrators, Congress volunteers chased the officers into a police station and burned it down, killing 26. Gandhi immediately suspended the campaign and soon after was imprisoned. It was another extraordinary, in and of itself, it was an extraordinary and unique moment, a leader calling off a movement at the height of its momentum. It was also an extremely controversial decision. His critics thought Gandhi was being naive and utopian in trying to eliminate all violence from popular resistance. Gandhi contested that he was well aware, quote, that violence there always will be. And again, repressive violence by the state was expected. Sporadic violence, he also said, outside the movement was expected, or even within it. The real danger was what he called political violence undertaken by participants who believed it advanced the movement's cause. This, Gandhi concluded, arose not merely from ignorance, but from a sense and delight in collective power. Acting in large numbers generated excitement, a sense of strength in numerical superiority, which then functioned as a form of coercion. When mass action relied on intimidation, power of numbers rather than self-restraint, for Gandhi, it mimicked violence in purpose and effect. This discovery led Gandhi to refine the core proposition of Satyagraha. Bringing masses into politics was essential. It allowed ordinary people to participate in their own emancipation. It was also a display of collective strength, but only if it was, for Gandhi, truly nonviolent, in the sense of being disciplined and constrained. What mass Satyagraha was meant to demonstrate was not brute numbers, but again, restraint, discipline, self-sacrifice, self-suffering. And what I want to emphasize, and I'll move to the next point, is it's through the staging of this truer, higher form of power. It was through the staging of discipline and suffering that this truer, higher form of power was revealed. It was also a capacity to organize, restrain, and rule oneself. So it was prefigurative in some sense of what Swaraj entailed. This insight would become the foundation, I think, of Gandhi's mature theory of mass politics. And to describe this form of protest, I discuss it in terms of dramatization. Now, so I gave that sort of a preview of a quick history of the development of Satyagraha to show why, especially in his late thinking, it was through this effort to correct what he saw as this internal tendency or drive towards violence within mass Satyagraha, a drive towards collective power, that pushed Gandhi over time to emphasize and clarify the centrality of discipline, suffering, sacrifice, specifically their deliberate dramatization in the structure of nonviolent protest. For Gandhi, it was never enough for a movement simply to declare its civil or nonviolent intentions. The more demanding and politically consequential question was how such intentions could be demonstrated and confirmed to skeptics, above all to opponents, potential allies, and the broader public. So how it can be seen and heard. Nonviolence, in other words, had to be visible to be credible, almost visible, instantly visible. The problem was not merely how to avoid violence, but how to perform nonviolence in a way that unmistakably conveyed strength coupled with moral seriousness. Any movement can assemble crowds and display collective power, but this power comes very often comes with a hint of threat. But nonviolent strength was meant to be displayed via dramatization, which in a more general sense means insisting on a kind of form and formality of protest. I mean, dramatization wasn't Gandhi's word. In fact, it's a word most often associated with Martin Luther King, who often used it to describe what was happening in a nonviolent protest. For King, used the term in two ways. One, to dramatize was to bring emphasis, to give emphasis to an experience of suffering or injustice. But dramatize also meant that the protest had a narrative arc, that there was dramatization, that in an instant when you saw a nonviolent protest, you could see who was on the side of justice. It would be visible in that way. In Gandhi, I think what was being dramatized, I'll discuss many things I think that are, but again, emphasizing it, what's being dramatized is not force or numerical power. Again, acts of self-sacrifice, self-mastery, self-suffering. I'll go into more detail of what that looks like. But before I go into that detail, I want to say a little bit more about what I take the purposes of dramatization to be, again, to be as clear as possible on what this positive effect is meant to be. So I think disciplined dramatization of suffering and restraint, that's a short word, I'd say, for the positive purpose of nonviolence. I think has multiple overlapping effects. On the one hand, for satyagrahis themselves, the practitioners of nonviolence, it functioned as a pedagogy of self-rule or of freedom, cultivating habits of self-control and patience. For the state supporters and its supporters or opponents, nonviolent protest disrupted expectations and undermined portrayals of protesters as anarchists, criminals, and irresponsible agitators. More crucially, dramatization made possible a form of nonviolent persuasion. The term Gandhi used more often than persuasion was actually conversion. One way I think we can think about this kind of persuasion is that it was aimed at making possible shifts in deep-seated prejudice, entrenched public opinion, not only among declared opponents, but maybe especially among those who had not yet taken sides. So people who are potentially your allies. Again, King would later describe this group as the uncommitted middle. For both King and Gandhi, these were not outsiders or enemies, but fellow citizens whose allegiance could still be gained. At the core of this account, in my understanding, is a psychological theory of political conflict and political change. And now I'm going to return to a quote that I started earlier, where Gandhi was reflecting back in 1931 on how he had become acutely aware of the limits of liberal political methods and more generally the limits of reason. Careful argument, factual correction, and appeals to reason fall on deaf ears, as opponents simply, quote, shut their ears to the voice of reason. Political beliefs he came to see were not held lightly or provisionally. They were bound up with identity, pride, and social position. Direct attacks on such beliefs often produce the opposite of the intended effect, leading people to, quote, hug their sin more tightly. Criticism is experienced as a personal affront, and reasoned disagreement often hardens into resentment and defensiveness. Violence and intimidation intensified these dynamics. Instead of persuasion or even stable compliance, they generated hostility, fear, and deeper resistance. Violence in this sense built psychological barriers that made openness to listening and reconsideration much less likely, if not impossible. Satyagraha, by contrast, tries to mitigate these expected psychological reactions rather than instigate them. When executed well, these coordinated displays of dignity, discipline, fearlessness, suffering, nonviolent protest tries to compel attention, subvert expectations, and unsettle these habitual responses. In Gandhi's terms, this is what it means to move the heart and awake the inner understanding in man. The hope and expectation The hope and expectation was not immediate agreement, but at least a pause in the polarizing spiral of accusation and counter-accusation, and at best, it would provoke a sense of wonder and surprise that allow people to register claims of justice and begin to reconsider identities, affiliations, commitments. This psychological logic is why Gandhi placed such an extraordinary emphasis on discipline and formality. Nonviolence is often described as occupying a moral high ground, but this framing assumes nonviolence is akin to simply moralizing, which we know too easily degenerates into self-righteousness or virtue signaling. The point of performing dignity was not to assert moral superiority, but to cut through the partisan clamor and mutual resentment so that a movement's message could be seen and heard. So the rituals, rules, and codes that often have come to define Gandhian nonviolence were not simply ethical demands or commitments. They were techniques for controlling, intensifying, manifesting a political message capable of persuasion. So here I'll look into specifically into what I think Gandhi was trying to stage, perform, and dramatize, and with what effects. And I've grouped them into three, eventually four. One is, the first is non-coercion. So nonviolent protest, though, not only avoided violence, but I want to say at its best, it also staged or dramatized the refusal to enact violence. So it was dramatizing, staging non-coercion. And it was especially essential for distinguishing satyagraha from intimidation and to draw people in that way. So, for example, Gandhi insisted that protesters would never physically threaten or frighten people. In nonviolent pickets, boycotts, and hartals, these day-long suspensions, one was to avoid shouting, harassment, physically blocking those who would not comply. Another form of non-coercion can be seen, I think, in Gandhi's preference for displays of silence, orderly comportment, slowness, prayer, fasting, and ritual purification over fiery speeches or aggressive demonstrations. Again, these practices were meant to draw people toward the movement. Fasting, in particular, was tightly circumscribed. Theoretically, it could never be directed, Gandhi wrote, against an opponent, where at its best it would function as moral blackmail. Demanding techniques like fasting were directed only towards one's closest allies. Gandhi would say those you're in a relationship of love, as an internal appeal to shared responsibility. Non-coercive tactics also preserve the capacity to withdraw or recalibrate, so a mode of self-correction. Second, Gandhi dramatized self-rule and self-discipline as an answer to the charge that was especially prominent in many movements for Gandhi, especially when you undertake civil disobedience, which was often accused as being equivalent to anarchic law-breaking. So civil disobedience for Gandhi was not a rejection of order, but a higher form of lawfulness. His campaigns always started with the taking of a vow, rules that were self-imposed on satyagrahis by themselves, through which the satyagrahis showed that they were capable of governing themselves, that they were lawmakers and not lawbreakers. So solemn vows also publicly bound participants to strict codes of conduct, displaying obedience to their own law rather than a disdain for all authority. Through this collective self-organization, the movement displayed a distinctive kind of power, the capacity to coordinate, to restrain itself, and self-govern. Third, another feature that was dramatized, which of course was sacrifice or self-sacrifice, and this, for Gandhi especially, distinguished satyagraha from criminality or really egoism. One of the core tenets of nonviolent protest was to accept the burdens of resistance rather than impose the costs on others. So openly breaking specific laws, and this is, of course, the most famous features, willingly accepting arrest and punishment without evasion or bitterness. But this was also involved in the idea of undertaking long marches, prolonged fasts, sustained suffering, and commitment. These are also dramatizing seriousness and resolve, but maybe something most specifically that the suffering was not an end in itself, but it was a means of showing that the participants in the movement were motivated by something more than their own grievance or their own self-interest, that there was some principle at stake. By placing their own bodies at risk, protesters signal that, again, these claims rested on conviction rather than a narrow understanding of grievance. The fourth I'm going to discuss through a different example, which is individuation. So what I want to do is give one, I'm going to, in the next section, just give a kind of account of three classic examples from the Gandhian repertoire to sort of show how all of these principles are dramatized in different ways. So one of them is the Hartal. So the Hartal was a day-long work stoppage. Often people say it kind of built up on a traditional practice of public mourning. So one day when a city would be shut down. And Gandhi really revived this as a political practice. He started all of his mass campaigns with a day of a Hartal, and he also used it in other moments to mark a grievance or a part of a resistance. But his rule of like what made a Hartal nonviolent was that the Hartal had to be announced in advance, and you had to refrain from pursuing compliance on the day itself. So in the case of during the Rowlatt Satyagraha and after, there were 3 or 4 between Rowlatt and non-cooperation. He would say the true Satyagraha, he would protect the shops that chose not to comply rather than try to intimidate closure. And a total Hartal of 100% compliance, he would say, implies coercion. So Gandhi insisted that the best demonstration of the truly voluntary character of the Hartal and a matter of pride from the Satyagraha standpoint would be if some shops stayed open, so like 80%, because 100% implies coercion. And indeed, he would say the true Satyagraha, he would go further, protect. So that would be, I think, dramatizing or staging non-coercion, like the refusal to intimidate, even though you might have the power to do so. The true Satyagraha, he would go further, protect the shops that chose not to comply from harassment. And again, this was dramatizing the voluntary nature of the protest, as well as restraint, as I just said. And in that, the movement demonstrated strength and confidence in the justness of their cause. But it also gets to this very sometimes elusive notion that Gandhi thought that kind of power of restraint was a higher power. You know, the power, if you can find a way to show that you had the power and chose not to immediately use it to dominate or to coerce, that's the kind of higher power that he always was trying to. He would say the other language would say forgiveness coming from that position is the ultimate sort of power. So, so then the other principle, the fourth that I didn't mention yet, which is also a dramatization. So there, it has sort of some of the elements of non-coercion, self-mastery, sacrifice. The fourth that I want to mention is that's dramatized in Gandhi and Satyagraha is individuation. And this came to the fore, especially in the period between non-cooperation leading up to the Salt Satyagraha. Non-cooperation ended in 1922. The Salt Satyagraha is 1930, when Gandhi was really preoccupied with both solving the problem of Chauri Chaura, the violence of Chauri Chaura, and advancing the constructive program. This was in 1920. So after the events of Chauri Chaura that led to the end of non-cooperation, Gandhi confronted this problem, as I mentioned earlier, of collective power. And he came to see that excitement of acting together was a kind of perennial problem of mass satyagraha. It wasn't something that could be easily corrected with just learning more, because in a way, the tendency of collective action, it's sort of a paradox of empowerment. Empowerment necessarily generates excitement and power and the pleasure of acting together. The problem was that this easily could tip over into displays of power, as I said. This paradox is specifically, Gandhi thought, in conditions of in this moment of decolonization was that ordinary people were recovering their power of action via satyagraha, but this power as agency was being imbricated with this temptation towards mastery, or an impulse to demonstrate this newly found power in acts of domination. In non-cooperation, this was often met in terms of non-cooperators attacking minorities or dissenters in some form. So he was extremely sensitive to the idea that this would bring a kind of future Swaraj that was more like a majoritarian tyranny than democracy. So Gandhi's challenge in the 20s, which he grappled with throughout, was to develop forms of mass satyagraha that could temper this collective egoism and still be effective without relying on sheer force. In a book published in that time called Satyagraha in South Africa, reflecting on that first 10 years of his political activism, he now describes Satyagraha, quote, as a force containing within itself seeds of progressive self-restraint. So this phrase, I think, captures the wager of Gandhian mass politics. Satyagraha is not simply, again, it's not simply a set of tactics that happen to be nonviolent. It's a mode of action designed to generate restraint from within, to build these limits and breaks in the performance of protest. And again, is crafting and dramatizing discipline that would moderate, limit, and slow the compulsions of collective mobilization rather than inflame them. And the fourth that I wanted to come back to, I think, is one of the most interesting modes was through the dramatization of individuation within the dynamics of mass satyagraha. As again, Gandhi feared that mass satyagraha would degenerate into a pure collective power or excitement and a brute power of numbers. And he wanted instead mass satyagraha to appear less like a crowd than a coordinated activity of disciplined individuals whose individuality would be maintained and expressed in their comportment, detachment, self-discipline. So if mass action could be given that individuating structure, it would neither depend or incite this egoism. So one of the best examples, I'll give two, and then I'll conclude. One of the best exemplars of this kind of individuated collective action was Gandhi's proposal for Khadi. So Khadi, it's a picture here, Khadi is hand spinning the wheel. It became the symbolic and material heart of Gandhi's constructive program, and arguably, as people discussed earlier today, of the heart of his politics. After his release from jail in 1924, Gandhi pushed relentlessly for Khadi, even attempting controversially to make hand spinning the basis of Gandhi Congress membership and a prerequisite for office holding in Congress that nobody liked. So but for Gandhi, Khadi mattered for many reasons. Partly because he thought it was a universal practice. It fostered identification between the rich and poor, kept rural poverty at the center of national debates, and offered a daily practice of inward directed discipline. He wanted really everyone to spend half an hour of their day doing spinning. But as a model of collective action, Khadi was a large-scale, decentralized, cooperative, collective system, but it was premised on the patient work of radically isolated individuals. Each spinner separately practiced self-rule, calming passion, loosening egoism, submitting to repetition. And people often say you have to concentrate. So while contributing to a collective project. So it's a bunch of individuals doing the same thing together, but not in a kind of collective synergy. So it was mass politics without the synergistic mass psychology. The second element, a second example, I think that actually pictures that is a last example from the salt raid, from the salt satyagraha. So the salt satyagraha started in 1930, so at the end of this, and it was it's Gandhi's most famous campaign. It's the exemplar of successful nonviolent protest of the 20th century, probably alongside the 1963 Birmingham campaign. They're the two that are taken as the most instructive. It's also Gandhi's last major mass satyagraha in India. And it had all the elements of dramatization. It had the drama of choosing salt, its symbolic power, the salt march, which slowly went I'm going to forget my mileage, 240 kilometers to the sea over 30 days, which was building up drama of what day would Gandhi get arrested. And then it exploded into these self-making of SALT as disobedience. But one of the most controversial features was the SALT raid. And on principle, it would see these were nonviolent raids, but they were pretty provocative of people attacking salt depots, provoking arrest. But what made them different was that they were very ritualistic. Two people would stand and go towards the entries to the salt depot, face a soldier, and be beaten. So that's very different than a kind of collective swarm. You can see the slowness, the ritualistic, and the formality. So I think that's a good example. Now, I think the earlier classical phase of nonviolence, from this moment to the anti-nuclear campaigns in Britain, the US civil rights movement, there is a continuation of this emphasis on directed actions like sit-ins, marches, freedom rides, were designed to dramatize nonviolent discipline as a public performance. But this has really been lost from the character of most nonviolent protests, really from 1968, or at least self-consciously. But I think, the last point I want to just say is, I think underlying it is, again, most people dismiss it because they think it's connected to a moral and religious commitment to nonviolence. But what I'm trying to show here is all of those practices were connected to a distinctive theory of political persuasion and the potential of political change. So for Gandhi and later King, the power of nonviolent contestation was precisely in this capacity to create this aesthetic, affective effect of protest. And I think very specifically a kind of experience of wonder, surprise, disruption in that sense. Richard Gregg, one of the early theorists, called it, this is what he would call moral jujitsu, but I think it's more this imaginative surprise, that dignity or restraint allowed for this just momentary moment of suspension to make the possibility of rethinking commitments, allegiances, alliances, and ultimately to make a kind of self-revision possible. So this, I think, is another way. I'll just end on this note, is that the problem with violence is that it would foreclose violence and intimidation tends to a defensive hardening of positions, and nonviolent action, when it is performed with this restraint, can hope to interrupt these reflexes of hostility, opening the space, however fragile, for receptivity. And it's a space where persuasion here is not mere bargaining or rational assent, but an invitation to self-revision or self-transformation. So a pressured, yet non-coercive demand to see oneself and one's political world differently. So I know.
So the floor is now open for Q&A. What I propose is that we'll take 3 questions at a time, and please be limited to 1 minute. To try to limit your question, say it within 1 minute. Thanks very much. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was a wonderful lecture. It refreshed my own memory. I thought I didn't know anything about Gandhi.
I gave a lesson from your high school of remembering the non-cooperation.
Unbelievable. I have a very simple question. Both Gandhi and King died violent deaths.
Yes.
Despite being pacifists in the real sense of the word. But more specifically is what I read is going on in India, land of his birth, is they flipped everything.
Yeah.
There is praise for the man who killed him.
Yes.
Why? I'm trying to frame this. Why does this happen?
Yes. I mean, it's an extraordinary fact. And I think it's a much harder question and a deeper question that I can answer. But just to reflect on its truth is, Gandhi was from Gujarat. And so Gujarat, there's always a question now I often hear is, now the question is, how is it possible that Gujarat in Gandhi's time was such a stalwart place of commitment to non-violence? I don't have there's probably a deep and long answer to think through the rise of Hindutva and a lot of people here could probably answer that question better. I do think there is something, I do think it's true that Gandhi's and Nehru's reputation have declined in the post-independence period. And it's probably at their lowest points. I mean, Gandhi is, sort of evacuated of political message and celebrated. And, in the worst way, our contemporary government, they celebrate his connection to toilets. I mean, that's how they want to remove it of any political content. But I think both of them suffer from the legacy of the Congress Party. So, in some ways, Gandhi and Nehru, if you're attacking the Congress Party, you're going to be attacking their reputation. So I think in a lot of different ways, Gandhi's reputation, also more generally, I'd say in India, Gandhi's name was associated with so many facets of the independence movement. And so there are lots of people who were disappointed, from partition to the very strong Dalit critique to the left critique, that I do think Gandhi doesn't really have a political presence in India in a real sense. The last sort of legacy was probably in the 70s and J.K. Nayan. So I think part of it is that in India, what's really debated is the ideology that Gandhi represents. I think what's actually interesting and missing is India was never really a site of a very sustained debate on satyagraha as a political practice, whereas the opposite happened when people moved Gandhi and satyagraha to the West. The first question they had to ask was to kind of separate the method from the social, cultural, religious embodiment. So it was really theorists in the civil rights movement and others who were adopting satyagraha who had to theorize it as a method and what it means as a method, what it tried to do. So I think in India that it's kind of it's there, but not actually centered because there's too much debate about Gandhi's nationalism, Gandhi's position on caste, Gandhi's the ideology takes over, and clearly a lot of Gandhian ideology has been rejected in some form or downplayed. So,
thank you so much. But just quick one point. I always thought the Gujarati people were very peaceful. It's we, the Bengalis, who were the troublemakers.
Yes, but right? It turns out to be true.
Thank you so much.
If you could introduce yourself, that would be nice.
Thank you so much. My name is Ridhima. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Toronto. I have two quick questions. One is, I wanted to hear a little bit more about in this individuation and its vision of mass politics, what is really at stake with the notion of the self? On the one hand, it seems that the self needs to be completely abnegated. I think Gandhi also speaks about the self becoming zero. And is there a paradox there? Because it also seems that in this kind of restraint and self-disciplining, the self also needs to be simultaneously, at the very least, consolidated. So what's really going on there? That's one. Yes. And the second maybe speaks to the previous question and your response. So Gandhi, right now in contemporary India, is on the one hand reviled and denounced, and on the other hand evacuated, but also appropriation of Gandhi by Modi, whether it's the even outside of all the toilet stuff. So
yoga, generally.
So what is it about? It seems like there is a durability to Gandhi, even when his politics is being corrupted and it's turned perverse. So can we think a little bit more about like this sort of durability, and why is it so important for Hindutva to work with Gandhi, even when corrupting him?
No, that's exactly right. The first question, yes, I think this is a really interesting question of what the Gandhian self is. And this, I think there is a debate in the literature too, between whether Gandhian self-making is about mastery over the self or mastering oneself in such an automatic way that you're not a master anymore. So part of the zero. So I tend to emphasize the self-mastery. I actually think for Gandhi, it's a continuous activity. And almost everything you're doing is about, especially his more severe version, is about disciplining the passions, not just bodily passions, the mind, the passions of the mind. You know, in Hind Swaraj, there's a lot about the grasping of the mind that you're constantly controlling. And I think there is something in an Indic view of the self where the self is, I remember one of my teachers, Sridipta Kaviraj, would always make this distinction that, the Western self creates itself vis-a-vis conflict with the other, that it's a master-slave dialectic, it's the dialectic with nature, whereas sometimes the Indic self has a kind of porousness. So what self-mastery is trying to do is to actually, it's individuating constantly, it's separating building this self as not to stop the porousness into nature, into society in some form. So I tend to focus on that. I think the zero idea sometimes to me and is more linked with the idea of not, it's so connected to overcoming bodily comfort, like needing zero and that's connected to a kind of theory of ahimsa too, about not trying to have your karmic effect of violence minimal, but that still requires a lot of work, I think. So I'm more in that view makes more sense to me than zero in the sense of being a kind of, I think Ajay Skaria sometimes thinks of it as a kind of like a set of practices without mastery. I think mastery can be redefined. So I'm not as anxious about self-mastery as maybe others might be. The second answer, I think you're absolutely right. Why Gandhi? Yes, so Nehru can be dismissed, but Gandhi can't. I think that part of that is Gandhi's global reputation. Gandhi, not only Gandhi's still Gandhi's the face of all the money. He's become such a symbol of Indian nationalism. It would take a lot. You can evacuate, but you can't take away. But I think part of it is also, he has a global resonance. And so Modi has to kind of appropriate that and can't, there's no point in fighting that. It doesn't have it is not the same political stakes, I think.
All right. Hi, I'm Davon Boyd. I'm Professor William and Mary. Karuna, this was fantastic. I wanted to ask you a question about rioting as a form of democratic redress, but I'll hold that back and instead ask whether you think Gandhi and maybe even King made any strategic or theoretical miscalculations in their moral calculus about nonviolence, right? So, you ended the lecture reflecting on the power of nonviolent contestation to create this political, affective, and aesthetic event. May it be wonder, imaginative, surprise. Some have even used the term being sublime, right? To make possibilities of rethinking allegiance possible. Yeah. But, how effective is nonviolence in, undermining these prejudiced portrayals of resistors and making the possibilities of rethinking allegiance as possible? I think one of the commentaries of the civil rights movement was that even the most civil forms of Black protests were still viewed criminally, right? You think about the iconography of the Nixon campaign in 1968. It wasn't just violent confrontations, but it was the nonviolent images of Blacks getting hauled into police cars that became symbolic of the silent majority, feeling that their political interests were being completely submerged by the speed or the acceleration of political progress. So I'm wondering if you have any response to that. Do you think they were right to make those kinds of assumptions about the aesthetic implications of nonviolent protests?
I think of it in two ways, which it's a deep, perpetual, and important question. And I don't, I think it's not like you. I don't think it's a simple empirical question. I think I tend to think of it in two ways. One is I think Gandhi and King, it's an orientation to persuasion that allows a building of a large coalition. So in some ways, whether they convinced everyone in another way that they would, I think, another way to assess success is between the major periods, did their coalition expand?
Mhm.
And it did. And I think there was certainly backlash. It never enveloped everyone. But I think the question would be, what were the tactics that lost them? You know, and this is more of a question of like the effects of Black Power or splintering away of the movement. It's hard, I always feel, in the civil rights movement, because of course King died in a decade.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a kind of, I mean, we've talked about this, extraordinary that King died at 39. Gandhi at 39 had just barely written Hind Swaraj. He had 40 more years of experimentation. And it's really hard, I think, to imagine what King would have been like with 40 years of, because you can have a lot of setbacks. Gandhi had a lot of setbacks, but he came back. And I do think in the period, in those 20 years, again, of course, he didn't convince clearly on questions of caste and had a huge conflict about it. But it's also the case that the coalition was building around that time, and there were sort of some public debate around those issues. So on the one hand, I think it's not, it's really about the orientation that is than the actual achievement. I don't think achievement is obvious. The second answer I give, and I think this is more open-ended, I just often think that when we say nonviolence doesn't work, we also have to think, and I think this is Chenoweth and that the strength of that Chenoweth and Stephan argument, even if you don't, the details you can contest. It's like, what are we comparing it to? What is, like, when you have violent change or more radical change, what is the theory of transformation? Because I think that's, Jose Medina, who we're talking about, there are some people trying to think through it, but I think often we have assumed accounts of transformation, which is we will re-educate people in the next generation. And that might in fact be true. That might in fact be how change happens. But I think this is the question of what's our actual theory of political change? What is the conditions of persuasion beyond defeat, Hi.
Thank you, Karuna. That's a fantastic lecture. It's so great to see you. So I have a question about the structure of nonviolent movements and whether this practice of dramatization depends on two things. One is, does it depend, or to what extent does it depend on the spectacle of violence against the nonviolent in order to trigger an affective critique of the powers that be and sympathy toward the nonviolent protesters? And secondly, to what extent does it depend upon the charismatic leader who is the focal point of the dramatization, or the focal point of the spectacle? So how can you create that sense of drama and of sacrifice and suffering within an egalitarian or leaderless kind of movement? And of course, I'm thinking of what's been happening in the streets of Minnesota and Minneapolis, where we have had both the spectacle of violence against the nonviolent in the executions of Alex Peretti and Renee Good, but also the sense of a kind of more diffuse practice of dramatizing solidarity, but also dramatizing self-discipline and commitment. So I'm wondering,
absolutely. Yeah, no, great question. So I mean, I think even in the case, so in the case of both Gandhi and King, and I can say it more clearly with Gandhi, Salt Satyagraha was very unique in being one which centered spectacular violence against Satyagrahis. Most of the others, as we say, Gandhi called them off because there was violence within the movement. And many of the temple entry movements, the others, the spectacle of violence wasn't central. I think what was more central was the power of numbers, of disciplined numbers, like consistency. Part of the Salt Satyagraha too, Gandhi was in jail, and the violence was against this stream of people who persisted. and were kind of the, shock troops willing to put their bodies on the line. So I think there is a misnomer in associating the success of nonviolence or the aesthetic affective effect with the actual display of violence, because actually, again, in King, we of course have Birmingham and Selma, but Montgomery didn't have that, or that wasn't the thing that made Montgomery boycott so important. It was because it was most important because it was 356 days. Like the persistence, it's extraordinary. It's hard to remember, a public, constant, organized effort. So I think both Gandhi and King would say that's the most important thing, is the prolonged effort that is the underground, of these moments that make it possible. But I think it also gets to a point that Devon was making earlier too, is there is some question where, for King and Gandhi, those moments of spectacular violence are ones in which they would say it's not the violence, it's the, what gives it that sense of surprise and wonder is the refusal to hit back and the dignity of that refusal to hit back. That's what, again, I think Devon, you're referring to like Robert Gooding Williams, who takes that as like a sublime moment that forces you to go back on yourself and rethink. So I think there are many moments in Gandhi I think in Gandhi and King of that kind of the force of that moment is not to shock. It is a shame, but the shame could be just trying to figure out, you see a scene and if you suddenly have to figure out whose side you're on, it's just triggering a reimagination or a repositioning. So I tend to think that it could be more, there has to be something that reconfigures, but it doesn't have to be the violence. I think to me, it's more staging the moral drama. And then for King, it would be the shaming is like, how do I see myself in this drama? Whose side am I on? And it has to reconfigure. It's like, that's what I think is the turning inward rather than the violence itself. Because I think sometimes the violence itself can be, it can be too much. The actual violence is too hard to actually, the emotional work can be very difficult. So that would be my sense. I also, the question of the charismatic leader, I mean, I think that especially in the post-68 or many of the movements in the 80s, where you really didn't need, I think in the Gandhi and King, the leader obviously was very central. There were ways in which, especially in certain moments, the fact that the leader is willing to lay themselves on the line obviously oriented people and brought people confidence. But I think that you often, but I think that you see a lot of the movements in the 80s and 90s that weren't dependent. They were really leaderless, and they in fact worked because there was so much repression. South Africa, these places had faced Philippines. It was like decades of repression, so you couldn't rely on leaders, and you had to rely on infrastructures that were below that could position people. I think of that often, our closest equivalent is, in some ways, Black Lives Matter had an infrastructure from the shooting of Trayvon Martin that could be resuscitated and built out. And I think part of what the discussion about ICE and Minnesota is like the underlying organizational structure, mutual aid, communal, there are other practices that can allow for that. But I think maybe, the question of like the discipline, I think there is an important question of like what, I think there are theories and practices like the Bosnian movement that was very decentralized, and their view is the more decentralized, then the rules are stronger. You do a protest this way, because if everyone doesn't do it the same way, it doesn't look like the same event. So I think there might be degrees in that way, and so I'm not sure it's dependent on a charismatic leader, but there's a real question about how movements can sustain those rules. And I think, to me, the problem in a way with the contemporary debate, and I'll leave it open as a controversial statement, is like there's a way. But I don't think for the explicit reasons. They want to, sometimes this irony is like they don't want to reject violence on principle. it's an odd thing to say, but they're accepting nonviolence, not on principle, but on practice. I mean, it's a very strange kind of refusal, you know.
Thank you. Lunchtime, just community member, not academically credential. Very simplistic, perhaps, question given the elevation of your talk. In a world where our attention is many demands upon it, let's just say,
Yeah.
and a world where social media has been redesigned to create triggering behaviors as a way of keeping an addiction in place, how do you create depth and interest and commitment to nonviolence within a broader population? I feel like when you had decades back when people sat and listened to someone for an extended period and internalized it, went to events together, took actions together and learned from young age, that it created a foundation inside. How does that manifest in this time period?
Yeah, I mean, we really are in many crisis moments. I mean, I think, the last decade, there was this phenomenon that people talked about, like Twitter revolution. So there was this moment where Twitter or social media could be used to bring people together, have a giant protest. And a lot of those people who reflected, especially the Arab Spring, I think one of those writers, Zeynep Terfetchi, has written on this, I forgot, she calls it Twitter and tear gas. But I think one of the things she says is, yes, the big difference is even in terms of what there's something ephemeral about those movements, because you can, it's easy to bring a lot of people out in one day, but it doesn't signal the kind of organizational depth that, what the March on Washington meant. That was months of organizing, all of this, like, to make sure it's staged exactly right, that nothing came out of control. So I think, but I think her answer in a way is what movements have learned too. And I guess, again, Minnesota or all of our local organizing around ICE is it has to be face-to-face. Like, in the end, you can use those tools. You can use social media to get people out, but the actual, the infrastructure has to be face-to-face. I think you're right that we live in a society where what is face-to-face is disappearing in some form, but I think it sort of just adds, it does add the sense, and I think you can see a lot of reasons too. Like Gandhi also thought part of he, even though it's a different period where he's, the media that matters to Gandhi is newspapers. So there are viral, the Salt raid, the images were not photos, but they were viral newspaper slogans. But I think he also thought that you can't, what you're organizing is local, and it can't, you're not organizing for media. And I think that a lot of things change over time, where sometimes when in the 60s, that sort of balance was switched, when you just did things, spectacular things to get media attention. But I think the classic theorists would say all of it has to have this embeddedness, and you have to have embeddedness in relationships. I think that's a kind of paradigm of organizing too. So I think it's right that we don't know how, I think it's still right to know if any of us have patience but I think, we're living in such a moment of transition. I do think it's hard to know what the revolutions of social media and AI will settle into. But lots of people, definitely on my campus, I've met a whole group of students who are Luddites and who are rejecting. So I think this is what people are trying to get at, like, how do we reconstruct some control and social relationships? But it's in one way it's new, but in another way, when you read Hind Swaraj, that's also what Gandhi thought modernity was, this constant temptation to live outside yourself, get distracted by pleasures, and that we always have to have a constant demand to turn inward, to have some silence, to have moments of meditation and learning who we are. So that I think the demand for that won't disappear.
Any other questions? Maybe this is the last one.
I'm Jennifer Shah, and my question is how you list a number of characteristics for the ahimsa or nonviolence.
Yeah.
And somewhere in the top discipline, somewhere,
Yeah.
you missed out or you have not alluded to the forgiveness. Because
Yes.
to have that quality,
Yes.
unless you have that quality, you cannot progress towards ahimsa.
Yeah.
Another comment on it?
I mean, I think it's true that Gandhi certainly thought forgiveness was a very central idea. But I think, the term that ahimsa, before he focused on ahimsa, the term he would use was prem or daya, so compassion or love. And I think it's always a difficult question because I think forgiveness is a very Christian concept. So I think depending on the genealogy of ahimsa, I'm less sure if ahimsa is necessarily connected to forgiveness. Forgiveness is connected for Gandhi to understand strength. But I do think ahimsa for him, in a way, I do think it's more closely connected to tapasya, or trying to stop a self that's always imbricated in relations of violence. And so I think that's to me, that's the more very core of the Gandhian question. But I have to think about it because he does talk about forgiveness, but I do feel like forgiveness is a much more central idea, maybe even in King than in Gandhi exactly. Yeah.
It's not a Western concept, it's a kshama.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely.
And
But
karuna.
Yes, of course. I know Karuna, but I have to think through it because I think you're right, and how that fits in, because he introduces ahimsa in a new way. So he both connects it to the older concepts and then moves it. So I have to think about that. It's a very good point.
Thanks very much, Karuna. I would also like to give a few thanks. First of all, thank you very much, Karuna, for accepting this invitation and for this stimulating evening. I remember you readily agreed. Thanks very much. Thanks, Bill, for your support and joining us. And Alex, I know without your office's support, this entire thing would not have been possible. Stephen, thank you for your constant guidance, which I could rely on, and for your admirable leadership, which I always thought is worth emulating. It won't be an exaggeration to say that this initiative on nonviolence would not have happened without Ajay Rao. He's the brainchild. Thanks, Ajay, for always being available and for fielding my Indian questions around it. I would also like to thank MD Nicole, our associate chair, for her constant support from the very first day we envisaged these events. This event would also not been possible without Deborah Burrows, assistant to the chair in our department, and her excellent organizational skills. Thanks to Laura Smith, our department manager, for keeping the budget ready, and Christian Lovell and Ben Jones from the Alumni Affairs were a huge support in both organizing and publicizing the event. I would also like to thank the participants of the workshop earlier in the day, Noel Anderson, Davon Boyd, Inder Marwa, Nazmul Sultan, Isaac Tranwick, Ag Tyne, and of course Karuna, and the discussants Turo Chang, Ajay, Stephen, and Emily. Thanks for your enthusiasm to come together for this ever timely, not just timely, ever timely conversation from the very first day I contacted you folks. I would also like to thank Shawar and Cyrus, my students who were behind the scene organizing and doing things. Thanks very much. And finally, thank you all for coming for this session. I would like to especially thank our alumni and community members and those alumni who will be tuning in to the event through recording. It is your constant engagement that strengthens the university's purpose as spaces for critical thinking that goes beyond the classroom. Please join us for a reception. Thanks very much.